With the changing climate and the different hazards that we are facing, how do we predict when our cities will be flooded? Or when a heavy rainfall will come? Or what the impacts will be if there are different compounded hazards in our environment? This is what Dr. Bapon Fakhruddin will explain to us when he discusses multi-hazard modeling. In today's coffee break, Dr. Fakhruddin of Tonkin+Taylor will give us an insight on his work and why we need this in planning our cities. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for tuning in to our Urbana's View coffee break with Urbana. And we're right now with Dr. Bapon Fakhruddin, who's actually from Bangladesh, but he's based now in New Zealand at Tonkin+Taylor. He's a disaster risk management specialist, and he's also um into climate modeling, am I right? And multi-hazard warning systems. So he has designed a lot of these multi-hazard systems, and in especially in the area in the Pacific areas, right? Am I right? Yeah.
And
So
Asia as well.
yeah, and right now he's going to talk to us about his background and how he got into to disaster risk management and multi-hazard modeling. Um, Maybe can you give us a brief background on your profession and how you got into that, where you
Yep.
graduated?
Thanks, Urbana, sir, for inviting me this coffee break. I have my coffee cup
Yeah,
with
let's have our
me.
coffee.
So, um, yeah, so I graduated in civil engineering in my early career as a Bachelor of Civil Engineering. Then I did my master's in water engineering, and then my PhD is also water engineering and environment. But most of the cases, like from bachelor's to master's and PhD, my research area was flood or early warning systems. So I was trying to building connection between the society and science. So I try to like a bridge in between. So try to understand what is the community requirement for flood
Yeah,
warning system,
yeah,
and then developing such kind of modeling when I just graduated in my bachelor degree. And I had also an opportunity to work in the flood forecasting warning center, so as an operational forecaster. So that gives me quite a bit of experience how the forecasting or hydrometeorological hazard has been detected and modeled, and then having a working with the community that gives me quite better understanding actually how those information could be transformed or translate into an impact so that could be utilized. And as you mentioned, being developed in a or born and brought up in a country like a Bangladesh, where flooding and cyclone is one of the major hazard, and you may see many of your families, you yourselves, and
yeah.
your neighbors are actually affecting of those hazard. That actually encouraged me to come to this profession where I'm working at this moment.
Yeah, I think that's very important for a lot of us working on disaster risk management, because as I mentioned earlier before we went online, we both have this interest on disaster risk management because we came from countries where it's always flooded, there are earthquakes. Bangladesh is also, you also have drought, right, in Bangladesh. So these are
Yep.
the things that we see in growing up, actually. So we may not have lived in a community where it gets flooded, but we see other communities around us that they get flooded. And over the years, you also become interested on how to deal with it, and the aspect of in your case, the engineering side of it, and how to better plan
Mhm.
cities, right? So when you were in Bangladesh, you started off as a flood warning forecasting professional, right? So how did that move into climate forecasting and multi-hazard modeling? And for the benefit of our viewers, can you explain what multi-hazard warning systems are?
Well, I mean, as you see, multi-hazard means actually you may have one hazard which could bring several other hazards together. So if I just give you an example of typhoon in Philippines or maybe a cyclone in
Yeah.
Bangladesh, so it brings you a multiple hazard with it. So one is it has a wind, so heavy gust wind, as well as it bringing storm surge,
Yeah.
and then it creating a flooding actually at the end of the day in the community. So you facing at wind risk as well as flood risk, and having these two hazard risk bringing you actually multi-hazard kind of environment. But again, with a heavy rainfall, and at the same time you may have a heavy rainfall with a cyclone, and then that could create a landslip if you are living in a mountainous area. So those are like cascading a hazard that actually linking with one hazard. So that's where we are saying a multi-hazard.
Yeah.
A single hazard could behave as a multi-hazard, or again, a multi-hazard means like you can have a single hazard like flood, cyclone, drought, earthquake. If you try to design those systems into one integrated way, that's why we are talking about more multi-hazard warning,
Yeah.
how that could be utilized for urban perspectives or
Yeah.
rural perspectives or community benefit.
And when you do, how important are the multi-hazard warning systems? How important is it that we integrate that in our urban planning, especially for areas where, let's say, in a valley or mountainous areas? How important are these concepts and technology?
Yep. So in terms of urban system, it's always a complex, if you know that
Yeah.
considering other natural area, because when you're building an urban systems, you're actually compromising your land use, you
Yeah.
are actually changing your habitat, you are changing your overall system integration. So which makes quite complex when you have some of those natural hazard actually hitting your area, and how you're gonna manage those, considering the present condition and considering the future condition. And when you're actually looking at future, where you now talking about climate change,
Yeah.
say what is going to happen next 20 years, not 50 years or next 100 years time. And when you're designing your urban infrastructure in a different ARI or different return period times, so one in 100 years maybe a building structure, or one in 20 years maybe a road, how are you going to incorporate some of those changes that foreseen or you don't know, and there are a lot of uncertainty to consider in your design
Yeah.
perspectives, to making sure that your hazard would be well managed, or people will be able to cope up with the
Yeah.
plan that you built up. And that's where I think the most challenges comes in forward, and we all looking at urban may having more suffering instead of other rural or natural environment because of this proper planning system. And why this is happening? Because there are some uncertainties when you are actually doing planning, or when you do planning, we are not quite visionary
Yeah.
to incorporating some of those future changes,
Yeah.
because anything has a high uncertainty, maybe it associated with higher costing for implementation.
True.
And as an urban planner or maybe a designer or an engineer, we often try to not to incorporate those things, or as
Yeah.
a builder, we try to reduce the cost, compromising those are the
Yeah.
impact.
Yeah, that's so true because in my experience as well, I remember when I was, when I started as a young planner, what it was only just land use plans, right? We all only have to do a land use plan. We do an environmental impact assessments, and those things. But we never really got into incorporating or mainstreaming disaster risk management into the urban plan or the land use plan. There are a lot of countries are already starting that climate adaptation that it has to be here in Rotterdam, where I'm based in the Netherlands. So we have this multi-layer safety approach. So that has been incorporated in the spatial design as well. So you have to do a lot of climate adaptive infrastructure, and but then I go back to that idea of looking at disaster risk management as only as a climate adaptive route, right? How do we incorporate also the the DRM principles into the urban planning?
Mhm.
How do you think we should do
I
that?
mean, I may also argue it's not only just DRM and urban planning, but
Yeah.
when you're looking at urban planning perspectives, you have actually several kind of plan that exist
Mm-hmm.
throughout the urban areas. It's not is maybe a the waterfront. If you're living in a say coastal area, you may need to have a coastal management plan. If you're looking at water resource, you may have a integrated water management plan. You have an environmental plan. You have a
Yeah.
transport plan. You have a
Yeah.
all sectoral plan in place
Correct.
actually. So which is actually horizontally distributed among the
Mm-hmm.
various ministry, but at the same time you have a vertical layer. So you have a national system, so you have a
Yeah.
provincial system, you have a local system.
Mm-hmm.
So how you are gonna incorporate this vertical versus horizontal all the plans into one single platform to making your
Correct.
decision making,
Correct.
and then how again the climate change and disaster risk reduction has been ensured that this has been incorporated in each of those sectoral plan.
Yeah.
That's quite critical.
Correct.
Even in a very urban environment, you may see that even there, like I'm talking about perspectives of New Zealand or maybe some of the Pacific island where you have mostly the coastal area because those are like islands. So you have a coastal islands where you have a coastal management plan, but that actually doesn't talk too much or having a so much integration with the water resource management plan because they both
Yeah.
separate
It's
and
true.
then they talk
It's true.
differently, so
Yeah.
that when there is a flooding happen, it may damage some coastal infrastructure. But when you have a coastal hazard happen, say for an example, a cyclone or probably a coastal inundation, that may damage your other flood infrastructure within the area. So
Mhm.
those are the many examples you may seen recently.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. It's a fascinating subject, right? I think a lot of us in the in this field of disaster risk management have been fascinated by this the developments and also the fact that it's really climate related. A
Yep.
lot of a lot of this natural disasters that we are having. So that my colleagues have been talking about, of course, like during coffee breaks, is of course like what we're experiencing right now, this COVID-19, and this is something that the both of us
Yep.
actually, I think, people will ask us all the time because you're working on disaster risk management, how do we cope with this? And just like them, I think a lot of us working in DRM, especially in the hard infrastructure, and we have not faced health uh, health disasters, if I may call it, because it is a disaster, like a
Mm.
pandemic. So how do you see our role here as DRM practitioners?
Well, I mean, for any pandemic, obviously that has a quite different phenomena that
Yeah.
we actually, as a normal disaster management practitioner, never face.
Yeah.
And also, this could be maybe a quite special for us because in our lifetime we are looking at some of this pandemic, how actually this can be responded or how the recovery process is ongoing. But to be frank, I mean, if you look at a pandemic, these are actually not new. I mean, this happened in the past. There has been so many lessons has been learned. But even though we may be slow in making preparedness to managing those pandemic, and obviously each pandemic has its own um, different way of mutation, different way of spreading kind of situation. So those are a little bit different than any other hazard management that we do as a practitioner. Even and with that perspective, if you look at even the Sendai framework that has been established in 2015, which mostly covers on disaster risk reduction on um, many hazard, but it also quite strongly emphasizes about public health. Um, but maybe one of the weakness in the Sendai was it didn't able to talk much on the cascading impact. So
Yeah,
for an example, you may have a COVID-19, but at the same time you may have facing a cyclone, or at the same time you may having an
yeah,
earthquake. Then how actually you gonna manage those situations? And responding to any pandemic depends on how fast actually you're able to get
yeah.
immunization in place, so or vaccine in place. So unless or until you have those in place, it actually uh, going on and on. So the one of the diagram that we presented in our policy brief, that is maybe a spiral network.
Oh,
So you'll always actually go back to a recovery to response, or
mm-hmm.
um, all the time till the system actually still the immunization in place. And also your emergency response plan, your
Yeah,
contingency plan, your recovery plan need to be updated based on the context. So those are like more dynamic. But in other disaster cases, we actually follow a standard guidebooks that how we gonna move from response to recovery.
yeah,
And we set out a time frame, and then within the time frame we finish our response, and then we go for recovery or mitigation activities. But in a pandemic, the situation is a little bit different than
yeah,
what we usually face. So that's one of the biggest changes. And
yeah,
also, when it's a pandemic, it requires more health professional
yeah.
expertise,
Correct.
which I think a normal disaster or DRR people doesn't have. So it need a quite multi-sector or multi expertise engagement to work together to develop a quite comprehensive response plan.
Yeah, a smart and comprehensive
Yeah.
response plan. I think one of the interviews that I've seen lately, I think of late was around 2 months ago before the pandemic, before it really became this big, was the interview by the finance minister of Singapore, I think, and he said something very very important. He said that this pandemic is actually a test of a government's social capital, healthcare system, and governance structure. So
Mhm.
I think that's very true because that's what we have been seeing so far in many of the countries that are doing well, and those countries that are not so doing well, and those countries that are almost getting into the, as what they say, almost flattening the curve, right? So one of the countries, as we know, that's doing very well is New Zealand, and you're so lucky to be living in New Zealand with your Prime Minister Jacinda. What can you tell us something that you have done quite well in addressing this pandemic, and what kind of policies did the PM
Mhm.
give?
One of the very important tasks or important things that, especially on the pandemic response, is the political governance or the political challenges. So you may see around the world actually, wherever the politicians able to take a quite, strategic and drastic response, they able to recover quite well. We are one of them, I should say, and our prime minister, as well as all the cabinet, able to take quite drastically the some of the action.
Yeah,
And one of the things was quite important here, I should say, is the risk communication.
yeah,
So
correct.
you, as a politician, people actually listen to you,
Mm-hmm.
and because you're our leader, and then
Yeah,
whatever you will say, we try to follow.
Yeah.
So once you, as a leader, you provide a quite clear
Mm-hmm.
and confined information, and you
Yeah.
also put together a picture that what is the consequence look like and what's going to happen
Yeah.
if you follow or if you don't follow. That actually gives us to give us some realization and adopt in our behavior. And that's what happened here in New Zealand. So from the beginning, the government was quite clear, but at the same time, they also took a lot of advice from multi-expertise like University of Auckland or Otago University, like a lot of pandemic experts work together with the government, as well as many other expertise to advise them. So what a pandemic scenario look like, what we have actually lessons from other countries for the time being. We are a little bit lucky that it start the time it is started. We have a little bit scenario from Korea, we have scenario from Italy, we have
Mm-hmm.
scenario from China.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at those three countries, what actually they did good, what they made mistake, and
Yeah.
how actually we
Correct.
could quite improve. Those are the things has been quite considered in our planning process, and that's one of the reason I think we are able to success drastically, and in every single phase. So you saw that
Yeah.
COVID-19 has a four phase, has according to the WHO guidelines, and each single phase, the government able to communicate quite clear
Mm-hmm.
and in advance that what each level means to us and how we're going to actually transition from one level to another.
Yeah.
So, and that I think was quite timely and
Mm-hmm.
accurately has been planned,
Yeah.
and that's the reason um, 95% of our people who are affected are right now recovered. But
Mm-hmm.
even though we lost some of the people, almost 21 people has been died with this COVID-19, which is a sad for the countries.
Mm-hmm.
That I should say in this regards. But you may also see some other countries, especially on the developing world, actually,
Yeah.
because maybe they didn't took this as a seriously. I could just say about the Bangladesh. So many of our ministers actually, or even as very high skilled medical doctor, they said in the beginning that, oh, this is not going to happen in Bangladesh.
Mm-hmm.
But they actually completely underestimated
Yeah.
the COVID-19 and its consequences. And they have to pay for these things right now because they put some information to the people. People start believing to them, and then
Mm-hmm.
now when you're changing your voice that no, we did actually wrong, we need to do this right,
Yeah.
but people are actually diverse, people actually don't have faith on it, and
Mm-hmm.
they don't follow those kind of instruction anymore. But also other than that, there are a lot of complexity when you go
Yeah.
to the developing world in
Yeah.
terms of
That's so true.
what accessibility of water, sanitation, your living condition,
Mm-hmm.
on an urban context. You may see a Singapore where they were doing quite well, but even they are able to actually failed to respond to recovery because of some of those communities spread out
Yeah.
in a very urbanized area. So unless you consider all these things into your planning process,
Yeah.
it's quite hard to minimize such kind of impact.
And also, I believe that in most developing countries, there are people, and even in some developed countries, in fact, there are some people who are daily wage earners. That they have this, they have there's no safety net. So if
Yep.
the government can also provide help to those people, there are so many factors, as you said. It's very complex. If this is already a complex situation for developed countries, or like economically developed countries, then I think it's even much more complex for those countries that are um, in, like low income, middle income. That's also, it's more complex because of the poverty and
Yep.
the situation. You know, it's I like the fact that you mentioned political will, and the idea of the New Zealand government to work with other governments on dealing with this to identify, especially you work with Australia and other Pacific areas, uh, on this, on how to deal with this. I think also there's a lot of value, especially at this point, to listen to science. Listen
Yep.
to science on how to deal with this, not just word of mouth or something.
Yep.
You have to really look for the facts, the science on this when you are going to deal with, especially health related issues. Of course, we have to have policies, but that's the way we have to deal with this. We have to work together. You have to create policies that is based on science,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
with that, I also would like to ask you, maybe for our parting message for the viewers, what are the for you the key takeaways in perhaps in your career as a disaster risk manager if they want to work on DRM and perhaps do a lot of climate modeling as well as what you're doing,
Mhm.
what are the things that you think you should go to, or principles that you have to follow?
Yeah, before answering these things, maybe I just like to also mention that, I mean, some of this pandemic or some of this disaster also you can name it as a like a useful disaster or useless disaster in a sense. So useful in a sense, like some of these things actually give us quite good lessons and we change our behavior based on that. So for an example, the 19th century cholera that actually enables the water and sanitation system in the UK. Similarly, if you look at the Pacific, the measles outbreak in the Pacific, like just before the COVID-19, that gives them a quite good lessons actually how to protect people from the measles and spreading the
Mm,
measles.
that's true.
And many of the Pacific island, that's why you see that there's a zero affected people actually by COVID-19. Samoa could be one of them, or Vanuatu.
Yeah.
So, those are actually so useful, I should say, useful disaster or useful actually hazard they're facing. But at the same time, maybe for the developing world who doesn't have enough capacity, as you just rightly mentioned, where you have a huge urban slum, you have a refugee of more than 1 million, and so it's just quite hard for them to managing such kind of pandemic, and when people actually doesn't have food unless they go out, so you cannot actually bind them to stay home kind of environment. You cannot force them to sanitize their hand when there is
Yeah.
no water in accessibility. So those are the quite challenging or useless actually disaster for them. But having said so, I mean, one of the things that people, whoever wants to work on DRR or climate change area, I should say that they have to have such kind of passion in their mind. This is a subject that you cannot just do for your goods, that okay, I study something and then I want to work as a profession, 9 to 5 job. That's how you will not able to grow up. But you have to have a real passion on it. You have to actually feel it. So once you feel it and you have a passion, you'll be able to actually grow up. And it requires also continuous improvement, like reading. So every days, every weeks, there are so many new researches coming out from the different researcher. So you need to spend at least few hours in every week to building your own capability, your own knowledge, that what is happening to the other world, how actually I can learn from others, and what I'm doing innovation in my work. So that is quite important. But at the same time, it also gives us as a profession a huge satisfaction, because at the end of the day, our goal is actually saving people's lives and reducing damages. So if we're able to save some people's life doing these disaster risk reduction activities, that actually gives anyone a huge satisfaction in their career, I believe. I saw not only myself, I saw people who work with me or in my field. They are actually quite enthusiastic and they feel so satisfaction. They work like, even sometimes they may work 24/7, but once they see some actually benefit the
Yeah.
community. They really feel proud themselves. They never mind to spending so many hours, long hours work by themselves. So that's one of the key message I like to say to young professional who actually really like to work in this field. And this is a interesting area, and this is quite demanding area in future, because
Yeah.
um, all of us actually wants to know the future,
Mm.
because if I know tomorrow what is happen, I can actually plan better myself.
Yeah.
And that's where actually the early warning system comes. So
Mm-hmm.
when you're talking about a natural hazard warning, so you're actually trying to predict what is going to happen next 24 hours, 48 hours, next 5 days, next 10 days, um, for that particular hazard. And then you actually start planning on that. Similarly, if you know that what is going to happen in your life next 24 hours or 48 hours, you may be able to change yourselves.
Yeah.
And
That's true.
I sometimes have a, because because of my early warning nature, I try to predict everything myself. So what is going, so I sometimes had quite doubt with, or sometimes have quite a lot of debate with my partner who is a medical professional. So I can actually predict my health condition, that if I have a running nose, what is the consequence after 3 days, and
Yeah.
then why I cannot actually protect myself from a flu or
Yeah.
damaging of my situation.
Mhm. Yeah, that's true. It also happened to me in when was that? Around March, when I because I have allergies, so I had to predict when I'm going to have an asthma attack.
Right, right,
So
right.
you have to take preventive measures, as we call
Yep,
it in DRM, and so you can always adapt to
that's right.
any situation. So
Yep.
I like that message. And before we end, I also would like to say that I did a little bit of snooping around. I watched your video, your introduction video at Tonkin+Taylor, where Bapon is currently the technical director of climate change and disaster risk management. Am I right?
Yes.
And you mentioned there that I really loved what you mentioned in your introduction video. That you said that basically it gives you satisfaction. You already mentioned that you already give it gives you satisfaction and happiness when you at least save at least just one life because of what you're doing, and that's already successful for you. I think that's a very good takeaway message for every one of us working in this field of disaster risk management. That it's very satisfying when at least even just one person we have saved. And with that, thank you for having coffee with me,
Thank you
Bapon,
so much.
and we will have more discussions on this. I hope we get to work together soon on
Thank you. Thank you so
on
much.
on a paper or a project together. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, and thank you for
Thanks.
gracing Coffee Break with Urbana.